Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the second day of what is already proving an extraordinary conference. I'm Richard Butterwick-Pawlikowski, and my co-chairman is Dr. Andriy Tyushka, who is a research fellow in the European Neighbourhood Policy Chair here at Tallinn. He's an expert in questions of security, strategy, foreign policy in Eastern Europe, and his research combines both constitutional questions and international relations. Our theme this morning is memory and justice at a time of transformation. Now, yesterday evening, Bogomila Berdychovska drew attention to the anger and the disappointment that those responsible for violence against civilians during the Revolution of Dignity and the protests on the Maidan had not been brought, with very few exceptions, they had not been brought to trial. Now, this is not only a Ukrainian phenomenon. In many places where totalitarian or autocratic regimes give way to political democracy, where individual political, economic, and cultural liberties flourish, then expectations become very high and are therefore easily disappointed, not least as regards the question of justice. But justice can be very hard to distinguish from questions of memory. And underlying both are disputes over what is truth and therefore how history is to be interpreted. The relationship, therefore, of Clio and Temida is an extremely difficult one. But if these hard questions are avoided, then wounds can fester, only to burst open poisonously decades later. And that is what has happened in Poland over the last 30 years, the avoidance of those difficult questions of what to do for those responsible for the worst crimes of the communist dictatorship. Questions that could have been addressed in the early 1990s, but were not, and it is so much more difficult to do so now. Ukraine is now facing very similar questions, those responsible for crimes of the totalitarian Soviet Union and those responsible for crimes under the Yanukovych regime. And this is bound up with questions of collective memory, whom to honor, whom to condemn, and by what legal means a narrative should be built around the kind of society, the kind of nation that Ukraine is to become. These are questions that will be addressed also in the sessions that follow. Many would feel that any kind of legal approach and criminalizing certain interpretations of the past are always dangerous. Others would say that this is inevitable and it is a question of getting those laws right. Now, this morning, we shall first have introductory remarks from Mykola Knyazhitskiy and Serhii Plokhii before we open up into a wider debate that will include elements of memory, include elements of justice, and will no doubt be exploring the tensions and the relations between these two concepts. So now let me briefly introduce and welcome our panelists. Mykola Knyazhitskiy, a warm welcome to you, is a distinguished journalist and politician. He chairs the editorial board of TVI and is a member of the Verkhovna Rada, where he chairs the Committee on Culture and Spirituality. Serhii Plokhii is an illustrious historian of Ukraine and Eastern Europe, and his range spans from the Middle Ages to the present. He currently directs the Harvard University Research Institute and is professor of Ukrainian history at Harvard. Dr. Mykola Petrov is a historian who works for the Memorial Society in Russia and is a specialist on Soviet security services. Dr. Igor Lyubashenko of the University of Social Sciences and Humanities in Warsaw is an expert on transitional justice. Dr. Gayle Lonergan of Birkbeck College of the University of London and the Higher School of Economics in St. Petersburg is a historian of the 19th and 20th century. Dr. Andriy Kohut is the director of the State Archive of the Security Service of Ukraine. Oleksandr Hrytsenko is Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Cultural Research at the National Academy of Arts of Ukraine, and he is an expert on memory policy and including the question of monuments. Tomasz Stryjek is Professor of the Institute of Political Studies of the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw. Andriy Meleshevych is Rector and President of the Kiev National Academy, Mykola National Academy of Ukraine. Sorry if I've slightly garbled that. And he, at the head of an institution which is respected for its work against corruption, is a distinguished expert on the legal approach to questions of corruption, of justice and memory more generally. So a very warm welcome to you all. Our first two keynote remarks, we'll ask them to keep them to about 10 minutes. Then some data will be presented by Dr. Tyushka, and then we'll be moving into questions regarding first memory, then justice, and we'll see how far we get with that. If things go well, I hope we'll be able to include questions and points from the floor. So, Mykola Knyazhitskiy, please.
Дякую.
Thank you. As a real politician, I sure will be responding not so much to your questions, but rather saying what I really wanted to say during this conference. What I'd like to begin with are the reasons, the causes. This conference is titled Three Revolutions. Have you found yourselves elsewhere in the world where three revolutions would have been held in such a short span of time? Have they been revolutions? What have they changed? And why is one succeeding another? Because when we think about drastic changes that would be able to stop the revolutions, they haven't taken place in Ukraine. Each of these revolutions, and we have spoken about it in this room already, was caused by the threat to the country's independence. The society has stood up against such political factors that could be a threat to their independence. Why are people so afraid of losing independence? Because Ukraine was traditionally divided between various states, and various parts of Ukraine have been colonized by these states. I would like to demonstrate to you several maps that have been prepared by a colleague of mine, Anatoly Tkachuk, based on sociological studies on stereotypes in Ukraine. This study was conducted in 2013, still before the last revolution. Please, let's screen the maps. We will be able to see them in a moment. Can you see? So we operated under various empires, so that's why we are different. People in various parts of Ukraine were asked about their attitude depending on where they live. So if people were asked from Kiev who lives in Donetsk, they said it was mafia. Lugansk was almost Russia. Crimea was a place of holiday. Another region was called partisan. So every region had some Kherson was ketchup, for example, because the best ketchup in Ukraine is produced there. And when inhabitants of Donetsk were asked the same question, even before the Russian aggression in 2013, they said Kiev was invaded by various newcomers, and when they were asked, the Donetsk inhabitants, what Ukraine was for them, specific regions of Ukraine, West Ukraine was where people got beaten for the Russians, closer to Kiev, but not West Ukraine, is already West Ukraine for them. The north is northern Ukraine. Then stereotypes that you see that are relevant for specific regions. It's very difficult to read from where I'm sitting, but the stereotypes completely vary depending on whether you ask inhabitants of the eastern or western Ukraine. And this map is Ukraine seen by inhabitants of Lviv. For them, Ukraine is only Lviv and the Lviv district. Kiev are the sold-out deputies. Donetsk is Akhmetov, the biggest oligarch. Crimea are communists. It's not a place to go on holiday, but it's a place that's only perceived as a political place. Odessa are Ukrainophobes, people who don't like Ukrainians. Subcarpathian are Hungarian. Ivano-Frankivsk are Potsuli. And another region is associated with beautiful women. And another one for the Subcarpathian region, Galicia are Poles, north are Russians. If you ask them, central Ukraine, they don't know. And Crimea, they want to go there at least once. Kiev is construction business because they mainly go there to work on construction sites. And Cherkasy is where Shevchenko was born. So here are maps drawn on the basis of sociological studies. They're ironic, but this is what people think. The next one. There are other regions that are described as well. These studies were conducted in 2013, and they show that at the time, Ukrainians, as the only nation that was self-aware and aware of its own state, was not functional yet. And that is the effect of the big colonization that lasted for many years. What worries me is that when I stopped being a journalist and started dealing with politics, I was shocked, and I still am shocked by that, because this political activity is also my experience of a journalist. I have been in the center of the political process, and as a mature man, I became a politician. And I come to ministries, to meetings of the Council of Ministries. I know how authorities work, what the mistakes are of the authorities. The post-colonial status of Ukraine was maintained before Maidan, and every Ukrainian official of the authorities wanted to get Russia's support, financial, corrupt, or any other kind, so that he was able to manage the territory, which did not have its in-depth identity. And such authorities were not interested in getting this identity, because then that would make it easier to manage those territories. And unfortunately, what's happening right now, according to me, well, it makes me very sad, because a large part of the Ukrainian elites still adopt the laws that are based on the wishes of our Western partners, especially the United States of America. So the arguments for our votings in the Council, in the Rada, to adopt certain laws is that the Americans are really asking us to do, so that's why we should adopt this or that law. So Well, it's very difficult to understand what the Americans are asking us to do, in fact. Sometimes it could be an inquiry from anti-corruption court or copyright law, and I should be voting the way my club is asking me to do, even though I don't agree with that, because it is the Americans that are trying to ensure their copyrights, but at the expense of Ukrainian creators or companies, because Americans are acting against, for example, the Ukrainian cinema that's only now getting revived. So very often these laws are subject to lobbying from various other countries, which means that the Ukrainian state, as the nucleus and the group of people and the Ukrainian parties that could have some shared values, well, this is something that still has not taken place, and that's the result of the colonization that we've seen. When we look at how states have been created that didn't exist before, like Israel, for example, you will see a group of people led by a leader who united the people who lived in kibbutz, who, even if they were millionaires, could get subordinated to people much poorer than them. If you look at Poland, you will see a group united in the solidarity movement, Solidarność, where they had common visions, plans, which they then put into practice while constructing their state. And the same happened in the Baltic states. Unfortunately, in our country, when the first democratic force came into power, the national Ukrainian movement was the origin of those people. They weren't able to maintain power and to reform the country, and that could have happened. But the Kravchuk and the dialogues of the first president with the movement resembled the Round Table of Poland, because they tried to seek a common solution for the country and they tried to build a new elites. Unfortunately, Kuchma took the victory. He was a strong politician, and he won because he was supported by Russia. And indeed, that Russian influence weakened the movement, which was similar to the Lithuanian movements. Russian money and gas came in, and the Russian colonial status remained. What changed later was that the state was distributed among oligarchs who were linked to Russia. And all those groups, all those stakeholders were interested in seeing such a distribution of the country, that people would have nothing more in common than money, and corruption plays a decisive role, that people could be bought. That was what the Ukrainian oligarchs were interested in, and that's why people who remember that we continued losing independence due to various empires springing up around us, these people oppose and they do Maidans, but the political class cannot be created that could run the country. And I think that our main job is to appoint a political class that has common shared values. And it is not a coincidence that I mentioned films. You will see one of them today. The first thing that we did in the Ukrainian parliament, and I was the author of that law, was difficult for me to adopt it because I consider myself a liberal. I have been and I am. But when we talk about Ukraine, one needs to bear in mind that there was no Ukrainian film. There were no Ukrainian films. We produced only 3 per year. And on each Ukrainian channels, we only viewed Russian series with Russian protagonists. Stalin was pictured, the NKWD. And that happened still after Maidan. So we banned those films that glorified totalitarian regime and totalitarian leaders and other powerful bodies of the Soviet Union. We also banned films produced by the aggressor state, Russia. We considered Russia to be an aggressor after 2014. So all that has led to a big boom and development of Ukrainian cinema and series. After that, we adopted another law that guaranteed financial support for the Ukrainian cinema. And I'm not just talking about TV series, but last year we produced 40 films. There were 40 premieres of Ukrainian films. Some of them had been produced before, but they premiered only last year, and they totaled 40. But this was a new phenomenon in Ukraine. Right now, we're looking at the adoption of the law on Ukrainian language as the state language, national language, official. We heard from one of the Russian researchers earlier who claimed that deleting Kivalov's law was a negative outcome because that law degraded Ukrainian and gave precedence to Russian. He said that cancelling that law caused Russia's attack on Ukraine. Of course, this was not the reason this aggression had been planned for a very long time, and you have heard that yesterday here. So until we are able to develop the one single way to defend Ukrainian culture that would unite Ukrainians, just as Poles are united by their culture, Jews are united by their culture when they built their states. Until we can do that, it will be difficult to build our state. We are often told that in the east of Ukraine, people are forced of being Ukrainized, of being forced. Some of them speak Russian. Of course, it's true, but the law that we're adopting does not ban people from speaking Russian. Other studies reveal that most parents want to school children in Ukrainian schools. We were only talking about the fact that Ukrainian culture should be popularized and should create opportunities for defending ethnic minorities, and should create a certain identity that would allow us to defend Ukraine from future aggression, because occupied territories, Donetsk and Lugansk, are areas where, despite the fact that many people speak Ukrainian, most speak Russian. These are the only territories where most people speak Russians are the ones that are currently being occupied. Crimea and eastern areas of Lugansk and Donetsk.
Knyazhitskiy for showing how the questions are linked: corruption and culture, memory and justice. There's so much more you could have said, but you've already provoked some debate, and we'll be coming back to the interlinking of these questions later on. Now I'd like to ask Professor Serhii Plokhii to take the microphone.
Thank you. And I wonder whether we can actually show one map that I sent earlier. I hope it's available, because it's really very important, essential for my presentation. While they're looking for that particular file, I would like to start. My presentation will be focused on the memory and memory politics, memory shift in Ukraine, as the result of the Revolution of Dignity and the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian war. Thank you. This is the map I had in mind. So this is one of many maps that were prepared as part of the MAPA Digital Atlas of Ukraine project that we have at Harvard University. And we are really very happy and proud to work together with Pavel Koval and his team here on the Three Revolutions project, contributing to the map making on the first revolution, Revoluция на граниті. So what this map shows, it divides Ukraine into 4 parts, and normally sociologists, political scientists also have 4 macro regions of Ukraine. Our macro regions are a little bit different. The map comes from 2010 elections presidential elections. In the dark red areas of Western Ukraine, these are the areas where more than 75% of people voted for Tymoshenko as the candidate in 2010. Light red, that's where she got more than 50%. Light blue, that's where Yanukovych got more than 50%. And dark blue, that's where he got more than 75%. So that was the basis for our division of Ukraine in these four macro regions. Now, what is happening? I don't see it here probably while I was transferring the map. Part one of the layers got lost because it's a complex GIS mapping. But what is missing at this map is the map of the so-called Leninopad or Lenin Fall. The demolition of monuments to Lenin between December of 2013 and June of 2014. And you will have to trust me, it's not on the map, but 90% of all the monuments that were demolished between December 2013 and June 2014 were demolished. Can we bring the map back, please? I think it's more important for you to see the map than my face. More than 90% of them were demolished in this light red area, which is called center. There was very few monuments left after 1991, 1992 in dark red areas in Western Ukraine, and relatively few in the blue areas. So the demolition of the monuments to Lenin, that was a phenomenon geographically, spatially linked almost exclusively to the center. So the revolution from below, this revolution against anti-Leninist revolt, happened in the center. It happened in conjunction with the very close relation to the real violence at Maidan in Ukraine and symbolic violence in the regions against monuments to Lenin. So the Lenin Fall starts on December 8th, 2013, when you have the largest, close to 1 million people rally in Kyiv. And then almost nothing happens, and then it picks up on February 21st when you have this violence in the center of Kyiv. Now, what does this mean? The next stage of Lenin Fall comes with the passing of the decommunization laws in 2015. So during the first stage of this revolution from below, approximately 550 monuments were demolished. As the result of decommunization laws, another 1,300 monuments were gone. Again, it's a lot of drama, a lot of wonderful articles and pictures and images, but overall, this is a relatively insignificant part of the monuments to Lenin that were there in 1991. Altogether, more than 5,500. So the Lenin Fall is really finished the process that started in 1990 and 1991. Now, what does this mean? Where does it come from? And most of what we hear, what we discuss, what we read in the newspapers deals with the Institute of National Memory. And the Institute of National Memory was really at the center of, in particular, decommunization laws. But there is very little discussion of actually what that means. Why the Institute of National Memory, that has, it seems to me, 40 members altogether, including the janitors and so on and so forth, was so successful. And I would like, in whatever time is remaining for my presentation, to point to a number of processes, broader processes that contributed to what eventually became decommunization laws, and I would say a major memory shift in Ukraine as a whole. So as a result of the revolution from below, this attack on Lenin's monument, in Ukraine we got a Lenin-free space that included West, Ukrainian West, and Ukrainian Center. Those areas were in Tymoshenko camp already in 2010. That means in the more or less national, democratic, national liberal or nationalist camp, depending on the region. And now you have the catch-up game where the space of memory catching up with the political space, and the two coincide. With the loss or de facto loss of Crimea and good part of Donbass, so those areas that are dark blue on the map that I was showing you, the balance of political power completely changed in Ukraine. For the first time, we see the majority appearing, and the majority would include West and Center, which through the parliament, through the laws, including decommunization laws, imposes certain solutions on the rest of the country, which is the, on the map there, the light blue color. This is the east or southeast, which is quite demoralized as the result of the Revolution of Dignity and the war that is going on. If the West and the Center believe that they know the truth, including the historical truth, the East is basically less convinced that they now know the truth, and they're prepared, they're open, they're prepared to experiment. And it is in these conditions that West and Center together, through the decommunization laws, if you will look at the parties that voted for those laws, they're mostly, the deputies are mostly elected in the West and in the Center. They propose this model of memory to the East. Now, why the revolt, why this attack on Lenin monument in Center? Where does it come from? Again, I pointed to you that there is chronologically a very close connection between the real violence on Maidan and this symbolic violence against the monuments. But if you look at the data on the attitude of the people in Ukraine to such things as Holodomor and definition of Holodomor or the Great Famine of 1932-1933 as a genocide, you see that in the Center, the belief that Holodomor was a genocide, and in that sense, basically one of the indications that these people bought into the part of national narrative and rejection of the communist past, that is there already since the Orange Revolution, since Yushchenko and Yushchenko's politics of history. The fact that Yanukovych comes to power and Yanukovych rejects famine as a genocide has no impact on the attitude of people in center of Ukraine. So at the end, the conflict between monuments to Lenin and rejection of the communist path through the acceptance of famine as a genocide come to that conflict in December 2013 and the first months of 2014. So there is a preparation for that. Now, we have by the early 2017, we have the entire Ukraine under the control of Kyiv to be a Lenin-free space when it comes to monuments. So from my point of view, it's a major shift that indicates the rejection of the communist narrative and the arrival of the elements of national and nationalist narrative. The big question for me, what is national, what is nationalist, and how that plays out in Ukraine as a whole. And one way to look at that would be to think about Stepan Bandera as a symbol, and it more or less functions that way in Ukraine, as a symbol of Ukrainian nationalism. And to think about the Ukrainian insurgent army and the idea of recognition of the fighters of the Ukrainian insurgent army as fighters for independence, as plus or minus indication of national narrative, because again, if Bandera is nationalism, fighting for independence is a good thing, so you are basically plugging into the Ukrainian, into the narrative of Ukrainian independence, and anything linked to the Ukrainian independence being a positive thing. So what we see here is, again, can we go back to the map? It's a very interesting situation. So Bandera, and there are altogether a little bit more than 40 monuments to Bandera today. It's mostly a phenomenon of the 3 Galician regions in Western Ukraine. But support for the monuments to Bandera in the last 2 or 3 years picked up also in Volhynia. So, for example, in Lutsk Oblast, where it was not before, it wasn't there before. So there is a rise of the popularity of Bandera, but it is still regional, and it is still limited to that dark red parts of that map. The popularity and the support for the recognition of the fighters of UPA as fighters for Ukrainian independence is actually moved into the center. So it's not only the recognition of famine as a genocide, but it's also the recognition of fighters of UPA as fighters for Ukrainian independence that is part of the narrative, historical narrative in the center. So if you look at nationalism and Bandera, to a degree that Bandera serves as a symbol of nationalism, it is limited to Western Ukraine, and center and east are together. When you look at the acceptance of the Ukrainian national narrative with the recognition of fighters of UPA as fighters for Ukrainian independence, that's where the center and the West are together. So the situation is different. So the center, in my interpretation, accepts elements of the national narrative but not nationalist, and the East actually is moving in the same direction. So center now rules. The revolution of memory that started in the center eventually moved to the east, and this process is now going on. There is a significant drop in the last 3 years among the people in the east who don't recognize famine as a genocide. So the highest percentage of those who didn't recognize it was in Donbass area, up to 30%. Quite high were in Odessa. They're just year after year, 2015, 2016, 2017, it's dropping. So there is, the center really now emerges as a major, the creator of a new standard and something that unites East and unites West. So now to the conclusions. First, again, I will go back where I started. I postulated that at the beginning. I hope that I provided enough argument to support that stand, is that what we witness in Ukraine is a memory shift. It's geographically related. It related also to the change of different narratives. So the monuments down, it's not just violence. It's also something important change in the perception of the past in Ukrainian society. So this is first point. The second point is that what we see now is that the memory space is now coincides with the political space. So the memory is playing catch-up game compared to the politics and political preferences. So this is second point. And the third one is that when it comes to the politics of memory, I would like to suggest that it also reflects a broader change in Ukraine. That for the first time since the independence of 1991, we see the emergence of majority in the country called Ukraine. The country that was divided almost 50-50 between red and blue, and at least since 2010. Now, with the, we hope, temporary loss of Donbass or biggest part of Donbass and Crimea, the situation changed dramatically. Now we have center and the West being together, and through the parliament and through the legislature, introducing laws on history, introducing laws on language, introducing laws on culture that Mykola Knyazhitskiy was talking about on the rest of Ukraine. And that is quite a new phenomenon. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much for such a clear explanation of what you called here a revolution in memory. And that shift has been plotted not only geographically, but also across time as well. Perhaps the question will arise later of the extent to which, if perhaps that shift goes so far in one direction, it has the potential for division, as well as seems to be the case at the moment, unification. At this point, I'd like to ask Andriy to take the mic.
Good morning. Before we actually open up the panel debate, I'd like to say a few words regarding what is at stake when we talk about the memory and the memory politics, as well as transitional justice in Ukraine. Although true that the problems themselves warrant separate discussions, and they are quite complex on their own when they get intertwined, and the more so perplexed by the external powers intrusion, the matter gets the more so perplexed and needs specific references to the real-life world out there. This is especially true for the issues and the policies of transitional justice, where not only the whole society of Ukraine, but first of all, those who are directly victims of both the annexation and the aggression in the Ukraine's east shall become the first and foremost concern of the state policies in this regard. What are we talking about in this context? It is the total area of 44,000 square meters, which equals to the territory of Switzerland or the Netherlands, and which makes up the 7% of the Ukrainian territory, which is currently out of the effective governmental control. When we regard the conflict in the east, it is nearly 3,700,000 victims who need to be regarded in the transitional and perhaps also the post-conflict justice measures, which effectively makes a population of today's Berlin. Furthermore, over 1,800,000 internally displaced persons are also a focus of the transitional justice policy in Ukraine. The death toll, which now surpassed the 10,000 people and continues to grow, includes 2,000 civilians, and also raises the questions of the justice and human rights, as well as social and political rights that need to be granted to their families, but also the people that still live in the occupied areas. Somehow missed from the debate, these are also infrastructural losses that amount to over 15 billion US dollars that occurred in the wake of the hostilities in the eastern Ukraine. Again, when we talk about Crimea, which is, as was also mentioned during the yesterday discussions, is not a topic of the Minsk process, and as well is not a part of the currently adopted Donbas reintegration laws. We are talking about more than 330 state-owned enterprises and more than 280 private enterprises that were nationalized by the occupying authorities. Just as we are talking about more than 1,600 private properties that were destroyed or taken over. It is particularly appalling that against this background, the transitional justice, the belated transitional justice in Ukraine also needs to deal with the reconstruction of a more distant path of the time when the Ukraine was suppressed by the totalitarian regimes, but also at the same time carry on its transitional justice measures and politics at the time of post-revolutionary transformation, as well as post-conflict society reconciliation and settlement. I'd like to hand over to Richard to open the first part of our debate, which would mostly focus on the memory and memory politics, including in the context of Ukraine's security, but also in the context of what repercussion the Ukrainian politics of memory has for the foreign policy and for the relations with the neighbors. And we will continue then with transitional and post-conflict justice matters.
Thank you very much, Andriy. I think it's very important that you drew attention to the possible future terms of the politics of memory and the politics of transitional justice. Because when, as we hope, that Donbass and the Crimea are reunited with Ukraine, there will be many questions of compensation, of of establishing the truth and of constructing a narrative which has the capability of uniting but also has the potential to divide. First, however, I'd like to ask Dr. Oleksandr Hrytsenko to comment on the questions of monuments, if you like, the Lenin fall, but also the raised by Professor Plokhii, but also the wider questions of the law, which Mr. Knyazhitskiy mentioned, which has already sort of provoked some raising of eyebrows. So, please.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very thankful to Professor Plokhii for talking about many points that I wanted to talk about, so I have a slightly smaller task to carry on. Actually, what he said was relevant to one of so-called decommunization laws, which are 3 or 4 according to various people. I'd like to analyze 3 major decommunization laws. The one about the condemnation of the totalitarian regimes and the prohibition of their propaganda. The other one was about official recognition of the national liberation fighters. And the third important law was on literally on immortalization or on commemoration or immortalization of the victory in the Second World War, which replaced the previous Yanukovych time law on commemoration of the victory in the Great Patriotic War, which actually was adopted in the first version was adopted in the year 2000, and then it was very importantly amended in 2011 by adding the so-called law on red flag of the victory, which also caused a lot of conflicts and criticism, perhaps as much as that as the famous Kivalov-Kolesnichenko law on the language. Therefore, it was a rather natural political reaction of the newly elected Verkhovna Rada to cancel these laws. But at least in the case of decommunization laws, they had to replace the previously adopted law of 2011. So, if we look at these pieces of legislation as policy acts, we have to analyze, which was to a great extent done by Professor Plokhii, what were the problems that these laws had to face, to deal with. The one was, actually, in my opinion, it was the problem that the first one had to solve was a twofold one. First, it was to successfully finish the 25 years old struggle for removing the at least symbolic heritage of the Soviet regime. It was regarded by many people, not only in political elites, but in the society as well, as part of the Central Eastern European way to Europe, to freedom, democracy, to being, quote unquote, a real European country. To be so, you have to get rid of communist time statues, of communist time street names, and so on. So that was like a very formal task. Another problem this law had to solve, or at least in part, was to deal with the fact that Soviet mythology and Soviet symbolic capital of the Soviet past was and still is being actively used by Russia and its allies in Ukraine for political and even for military mobilization. Well, beginning with the famous those Colorado beetle ribbons and so on. So we can also look at these laws as a part of war effort, and some analysts did so. And they are, in a way, a part of war effort. And this fact was used by many to explain why there are some, well, at least formal limitation of the constitutional liberties in this wars. For instance, the criminal responsibility for propaganda of the totalitarian regime, which is kind of acceptable in time of war and not completely acceptable in normal peaceful times. The other law on the official recognition of the liberation struggle, of liberation fighters, was also the result of very long process of basically unsuccessful attempts to achieve the official recognition of the status of the UPA fighters and of their role in the struggle for independence. And if we compare this law to the previous versions, which were drafted but not accepted by the previous parliaments, it's much more inclusive. The UPA and the OUN are only 1 or 1.5 lines in the long list of organizations, both political and military, which are recognized by this law as freedom fighters, as independence fighters. And the third one solves the problem that is perhaps not that important for most of the society, but is important for dealing with Russian propaganda, which and those people who are vulnerable to it. With regards to the heritage, the symbolic heritage of the Second World War, or of so-called Great Patriotic War. And I must remind you that the efforts to deal with this problem were not very successfully made by Yushchenko and his allies in his efforts to achieve reconciliation between the UPA veterans and the Soviet veterans. It was not very successful, so an attempt to achieve the solution to this problem was made in this war. It is also, in a way, inclusive, because it does not, at least explicitly, removes any part of symbolic capital that these Soviet war veterans have. It just removes the, let's say, the monopoly of the Soviet war veterans on being liberators of Ukraine in World War II. And if we regard these 3 laws as part of memory policy, we have to answer questions about how effective they were and how efficient they are. Effective in terms that how do they solve the formal problems, the formal tasks which are present in these laws. For instance, the removal of Soviet status, the renaming, the changing of Soviet street names, and there are very important parts of the decommunization laws that has been not much addressed so far, which relate to the election process. There are limitations on political parties and individual candidates which run for elections. And some parties and candidates can be excluded from election process if they are proven to be engaged in the propaganda of the totalitarian regime. So this part of the law has not been tested yet, so it's still to come. But with regards to formal effectiveness and to efficiency, by efficiency I mean if we compare the positive results with the price we have to pay, the political price we have to pay, these 3 laws were first much more effective than the previous attempts to solve these problems, and second, they were, well, at least for me, surprisingly efficient. I mean that the number and the scale of the conflicts allegedly caused by these laws were much smaller than predicted by many experts, so-called experts.
Right, thank
That's
you
basically
for that very sort of optimistic
well, it's
interpretation.
You may call it optimistic.
Now, particularly sitting from where I am, it strikes me that although you've made a case that the potential for division within Ukraine between those who look back to the memory of the Red Army,
you know, they reflect the already existing divisions.
Right.
You know, the potential was you know, realized already.
Right. But the argument, I take it, is that the actual division has been less than might have been feared as a result, and that the yes, yeah, okay. But one area where there has certainly been conflict in consequence of these laws has been in relation with Poland, which has adopted, in many respects, some quite analogous laws. And now I'd like to bring in Tomasz Stryjek here to provide another perspective on this question of legislating for the past.
I will allow myself to speak in Polish. Of course, currently in Polish-Ukrainian relations we have a very bad period, if not the worst, concerning history and memory politics since 1991. We have a kind of memory war via legal instruments, and by the end of January of this year, the Polish Parliament adopted an amendment of the law on the Institute of National Memory, which foresees sanctions of up to 3 years of imprisonment for negating crimes against humanity, meaning Polish people, on the part of the Ukrainians from 1951 to 1950. So it covers not only the Volyn massacres, but also attacks on Polish officials in the 1920s and 30s, activities by UPA already on Soviet territory after the end of World War II, where operations against civilians are included, and as Professor Butterwick told us before, or Professor Hrytsenko mentioned, the law on freedom fighters in the Verkhovna Rada introduced some legal restrictions without penal sanctions, but introduced that it was not allowed to negate that the UPA did fight for Ukraine's independence. So it created an unclear situation, because it wasn't clear what would be the sanction, what would be the consequence of statements undermining the fact or questioning the fact that UPA should be honored for fighting for Ukraine's independence. So we have a situation where one side introduces an unclear regulation, but a legal one, on history, and the other side responded with a drastic measure of law foreseeing sanctions of prison up to 3 years. That's the legislators' reaction. Well, it would be quite a severe sanction, in fact. So the situation is very bad in mutual relations, and I shouldn't talk about efforts to find a way out of this. like the Forum of Polish and Ukrainian memory institutes working together and claiming that only one side could visit the other because in the other way around they would fear being imprisoned. And then we claim that our law wouldn't actually be enforced. The authorities suggest that it's a law which wouldn't be enforced, but it depends on negotiations with Israel and the questions of commemorating the Holocaust. And it's not clear whether this law will be changed. On the Polish side, we can see that essentially Ukraine's position is being ignored, and only Israel's position and international opinion protecting the memory of the Holocaust, especially the United States, are crucial for the fate of this legislation. But I'd like to mention also that we are trying to conduct research in Poland and Ukraine on collective memory and public opinion on historical events. And I would like to note a result we have from February, which hasn't been yet duly analyzed. I don't have any graphs or reports from this research yet. But in Ukraine, researching a population of 2,000 persons all over Ukraine in all the regions, we have an interesting result that indeed, as we heard already from Professor Plokhii and Professor Hrytsenko, Bandera and UPA divide rather than unite. What is uniting the population is the victory in World War II, because the question on how do you assess positively, neutrally or negatively the Ukrainians' participation in the Red Army and in the underground, 90% responds positively, negatively 9%, the rest is neutral. And the assessment of the UPA army in the years 1940 to 50 in the struggle against the Soviet Union, only 20% responds positively. Well, we hear from the side that it's 40%. Well, 24% positive, 29% negative, and 20% neutral. So if we regionalize by 4 regions with Western, Central, Eastern, and Southern, in the South, the degree of rejection of UPA and Bandera is extremely high. So Stalin is perceived more positively in Ukraine than Bandera. In the West, it's completely different perception, but on average, we get only 24% positive and 29% negative perceptions, whereas the Soviet Union has 57% and positive and 9% negative. So we have a huge differentiation inside Ukraine regionally, and myths from World War II, the Soviet myth of victory in the war, where ordinary Ukrainian people, of whom several million were involved in the Red Army. So UPA army is its freedom fighters are only worshipped in Western Ukraine. It's a regional phenomenon, not an all-Ukrainian phenomenon. And Bandera himself, today in 2018, the result is whether you sympathize or you find him antipathetic or neutral. All over Ukraine, it's 29%, 39% negative, 33% neutral. Whereas for Stalin, it's different. And in the South, Stalin is ahead of Bandera in terms of positive. So there is a policy of memory. The center of the country is where it is focused, where it is concentrated. And the south and to a lesser extent the east are areas where this view of the past is effectively different and is a source of conflict if this historical memory question were being imposed too energetically. So it's a source of potential conflict which doesn't exist today because of the war and more important issues which put this historical memory aside, and also because the population doesn't have that many means of expression, of participation in public debate, like in the west of Ukraine. It is the case, and in the center and in the east, the confidence in government is lesser than elsewhere. So what the state is actually doing doesn't concern people that much, and therefore today there is no conflict, but potentially it could break out. And let me conclude that Poland, by adopting its laws in question, is just fueling tension in Ukraine without considering that they are playing very high stakes of integrating their identity, and the perception of their heroes, so that it is detrimental for history, for their memory, and for their politics.
But I would like to sort of broaden this out. Well, the point made about the south of Ukraine corresponds to what we were hearing from Professor Hrytsenko yesterday evening. The question of the assessment of Stalin, of the Soviet Union, the Soviet army, this is the natural point at which I'd like to ask Nikita Petrov to make some remarks on the assessment of what the Soviet Union was, what it represented, and how to deal with it.
Спасибо. В советском понятно, что отношение к прошлому менялось в зависимости от того.
There have been different attitudes in the past depending on how history developed and who managed the Soviet Union. In Khrushchev's era, Stalin was condemned, but other activists weren't, and it was only in 1991 after the coup in August 1991 and the abolishment of the Soviet Union authorities, the decommunization and process was possible. But how it happens was that it was not possible to fully implement the processes of decommunization because the old party staff and the old ideologist activists, they were active in the new authorities. There are at least two new laws in Russia which make an assessment of the past. This is the rehabilitation law, which talks about the totalitarian regime that led to repressions in the country and many millions of victims. And there is a decision of the Constitutional Court, and it's not what we've expected. The Constitutional Court was going to condemn communist authorities as non-constitutional, but it only concluded that the political bureau had unlimited power, had it presided over by the secretary, and that its authority was based on violence. This enabled some decisions, not only to the end of decommunization, but it was also possible to initiate court hearings and involving the activists of that regime. But the Russian propaganda in the 1990s was opposed to that. At the time, in the Baltic states, communist officials were judged because this was interpreted as violence towards anti-fascists, and unfortunately there were no such evaluations in the general law in the Baltic states and in Ukraine, since Ukraine was, as a country, has only in existence since 1991, so those evaluations don't need to be rushed. These issues can be reviewed gradually. Therefore, such evaluations were not carried out quickly in Ukraine. In Russia, however, the situation is much worse. The imperialist attitude is coming back. The legacy of the 1935 victory, and that's a point which is very important in ideology. Why is the victory of 1945 so important? There might have been other events in the history of our country that could have been considered achievements, such as Gagarin and his accomplishments and others, but it's too little, because from the point of view of an empire, these are details. And the victory of 1945 is the most important thing, because that had turned the whole world around from the point of view of the Soviet Union. It changed the Soviet Union into the Red Empire with satellite countries. And that was a point when the country regained territories lost earlier and its state of possession. So that event, the victory of 1945, allows Russian propaganda to talk about the fact that it was the Soviet Union that saved the entire world from the plague of Nazism. And the Allies, the United States, the UK, France, and dozens of other countries that had sent their soldiers to the Western Front, they fought as well, didn't they? And what is the Kremlin propaganda today? They say that these soldiers had fought for their own interests, and it was only the Soviet Union that fought for the interest of humanity as such. And this is what today constitutes the grounds of the cult of victory and the new religion in our society. And that legacy of the victory also legitimizes Stalin, because it's all linked, because it was in the Stalin era. He has been condemned, and the reprisals that he was the author of and the crimes of war that he was the author of are being condemned, but the victory was at the time. So this allows the Kremlin to wear two hats. So on the one hand, they condemn, and of course they say that the Stalinist regime's reprisals cannot be justified, but on the other hand, therein lies the victory, the event which changed the entire world. So where does the revival lead us, the revival of respect towards Stalin? Adopting laws which ban the description of Stalinist policies, and I will go back to it. We will go back to it later. And of course, legitimizing the Soviet regime. It is now being also transposed to the new Russian regime, which in fact emulates the old Soviet regime. There are similar geographical, political problems, and the fears, the archetypical fears that are there, that are present. So here is the philosophical principle of negating the negation. The first Yeltsin government rejected the Soviet governance, and the Russia of today rejects the Yeltsin's rejection of the Soviet principles. Then another period will follow in the Russian history, which will
making that so clear. At this point, I'd like to ask Gayle to pick up the thread, please.
I'll pick up the thread in a way. When I was first asked here, I actually just replied and said, I'm terribly sorry, I don't know anything about Ukraine. I think you've called the wrong person. But I suppose my feeling is that as an outsider, you can possibly make some general reflections. And picking up on Nikita's point about sort of memories and how far you go. So basically now the great cult of the Great Patriotic War and the victory of the Great Patriotic War. I've got used over the years to going backwards and forwards to Russia and around former Eastern Europe, and seeing new monuments built. Thank you. And monuments dragged down. Is there something that's feedback? Okay. And I was in Moscow last year, last March, and I came out of the Lenin Library, tootled around, and saw something that genuinely shocked me. I mean, I remember going to Moscow and seeing the Peter the Great statue, and Iraklit Seritel is, how can I describe it? Huge, horrific monument to Peter the Great, outsized, very imperial, shocked me when I saw that. But what I saw shocked me even more as I turned round the corner and I saw a huge, heavy monument to Saint Vladimir. And I remember my first thought, I had heard about it, of course I had, I wasn't quite aware of the size of it behind the Kremlin. And my first thought was that while I've been sort of dubious about a lot of the claims about Russia's new imperial mode, it suddenly struck me in a kind of rather fatuous thought, well, next stop Kiev. When the kind of, to take a monument like that, it's one of the problems of these sort of shared histories. They're not the same place. Kiev and Rus, you know, I mean, it's like Russians, are they the Scythians? Are the Bulgarians, the Thracians? I mean, how far do we want to go? And so that was one of my things about history. I mean, it depends how far you want to plumb and where you go looking and what you choose to dig up. And this is whereby, I mean, I sort of partly mentioned this the other day on, was it Thursday, I think, when we had our discussion on the history of it. Because there's so many sort of jubilees being also sort of, it's 100 years of this, 100 years of that, we're going back over everything, it'll be 50 years of this. And of course this year, I mean, Ukraine, its first attempt at independence, while you can go back to the sort of Bandera period, it is January 1918. And you really have 100 years of trying to come out, the collapse of empires that we saw with the end of the First World War. And of course, one of the things that struck me yesterday as I was listening to François Hollande and Arseny Yatsenyuk, it brought back sort of things I'd read about when you read the transcripts from Versailles. And of course, Versailles will be marked this year as well, at the end of the First World War. And of course, what you have to remember is that as all these empires collapsed, nations came along wanting recognition. And the nations that came along demanding recognition at Versailles, one of them, of course, was Ukraine. Another one was Armenia. They were all ultimately unsuccessful. And that's what yesterday partly reminded me of, is that many words would be spoken. I mean, you can sit there and say the moral right for you to have a nation. You can sit there and talk about the injustices. Why shouldn't you have a nation? They've done this to me, they've done that to me. But the reality, I mean, history doesn't repeat itself. But I do think there are lessons you can learn from certain things. And the lesson from Versailles is, let me take you to actually just before that. So there was another treaty before Versailles, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was March 1918, which the Russians, whatever it was called at the time, but the Russians didn't want to accept. But they were forced into it, and they were forced into it by the Germans. And they knew that if they didn't accept it, they would literally be overrun. And the Germans forced on the Russians an acceptance of a state of Ukraine. Now, of course, it didn't last, because as we know, we all know how the First World War ended. But it made me think yesterday, and again when I was listening to Stefan Hedlund, and then, is it Taras Kozhil? I can't, Kozhil. And they, in many ways, their statements were quite outrageous. You could sit there and say, look, declare war now. Or the other one said, God, isn't Trump great for Ukraine? You know, it's like the whole, everyone, what? But it did make me think that what you learn from Versailles is to go along with your pleas. In many ways, there's, you know, Arseny Yevsenyuk gave a beautiful speech. But to go along with your pleas to the great powers, maybe not. And maybe that what we could learn is from Brest-Litovsk is that if you want to take on one beast, you need to be backed by a much bigger beast. And in many ways, you could say that, although maybe outrageous their statements were, that the Trump America, which seems to be moving in a certain direction, regardless of whether supposedly, I don't know, like they had prostitutes urinating on him or whatever, and they've got something on him, I have no clue. But it certainly seems to be moving in that direction. And then, I mean, as we keep finding out in the last week, the body count is numbering in the UK of the sheer number of sort of Russian citizens that appear to be bumped off there. That maybe there is a movement and a time now that Ukraine could possibly use. And then my final thought is that regarding memory, and again, this is a question of, it's a kind of like you know, you seem to be given a chocolate box of memories and you select that one. You know, everybody immediately goes for the nice truffle. And then the lemon cream's left at the end. And my question actually is I suppose to Serhii, not being an expert at all on Ukrainian history, but it strikes me from this period, the period that I do know, is Petliura and Makhno. I mean, what is their relation to any of this sort of Ukrainian independent history? Because I don't really hear much about them. I keep hearing about Bandera. And it strikes me there are various other things, but are these problematic, I presume, in Ukrainian history? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Gayle. We'll perhaps get back to your questions after we move forward to the debate on the transitional justice. I think what you said nicely wraps up the whole dilemma that we face with the memory politics, basically the politicization and the instrumentalization, not only for the domestic purposes, but also for international purposes. As we move forward to the topic, which is no less overshadowed by various preconceived truths and myths and stereotypes, but which, on the other hand, needs a clear clarity and legal precision to guarantee what it actually endeavors to guarantee: the criminal justice, the truth, the establishing of truth, as well as the protection of human, social, political rights, including the guarantees of non-recurrence of the crimes of the past. I'd like to address the first question to Igor Lyubashenko, who is the author of the recently published monograph on transitional justice. And I'd like to ask, I mean, the point was also raised yesterday by Mr. Chubarov, asking whether the Ukrainian state already thinks in the post-conflict terms and whether it has a clear line, clear policy line on what happens after the deoccupation and reintegration, and whether there are any constitutional and political mechanisms already provided for the post-conflict justice. In this regard, the question is, at which stage are we when we talk about the transitional justice in Ukraine? Is it still the matter that refers to the more distant and more recent past, but does not that much project to the, say, future time horizons?
Thank you very much. It's okay. I would like maybe to, first of all, underline a couple of things. I'm not a historian and I'm not a lawyer, so my speech will be from the perspective of a political scientist, who I am. And my view on political justice will be a view of a political scientist, because the problem, I think, I would like to start with a kind of explanation what we mean by transitional justice, because quite often very different things are taken as transitional justice. Transitional justice is a contested, so-called contested concept. So if we would talk about South Africa, for example, here we would talk about completely different mechanisms. Ukraine is very specific in this way. So I understand political justice as primarily as a politicized justice. Politicized justice in extraordinary times. There are, I think, two things are necessary to consider some policy as a part of transitional justice. One is so-called large-scale violence, and this can be very different kind of violence. It can be direct violence or indirect violence. Like sometimes in the recent literature actually thinks about corruption as such violence, which can be also addressed by transitional justice mechanism. And then the second thing about transitional justice is, as I already said, it is politicized. It involves politics inevitably. So when you have kind of situation when an ordinary means of dealing with different kinds of violence are not enough, it opens a way for politicians to propose different mechanisms to deal with the emotions of injustice that exist in a given society. And if you think about it, all these things that we have discussed today and partially yesterday fit into this category. What also is important to understand is there is a need to have some kind of, I call it, a normative anchor of transitional justice. Therefore, there should be some normative goal towards which these extraordinary measures are being implemented. And well, as we usually understand this goal as building a liberal democratic state. So there are usually two kinds of circumstances in which transitional justice is being applied. First of all, it is a transition from authoritarianism to democracy, and the second is post-conflict, or in other words, a transition from conflict to peace. What is unique for Ukraine is that it faces both circumstances at the same time. And yeah, well, if I see at least three dimensions of transitional justice policies in Ukraine. First one is what was discussed in the previous part of this panel. We can call it historical justice, dealing with the distant past of communism. The second dimension is, we can call it post-Yanukovych justice, so dealing with the legacy of Yanukovych regime, but not only Yanukovych regime, but the whole this post-1999 period. And I assume that Professor Meleshevych will talk a little bit about fighting corruption, which fits into this field. And the third dimension is actually this Donbas conflict. And this brings me directly to your question, so that was kind of very long introduction. I would say that, to answer directly a question, no, there is no any comprehensive, well-thought policy of Ukrainian state about how to deal with the post-conflict situation. And the truth is that there is no much possibility to design such policy, as the very notion of post-conflict says that there should be a post-conflict situation. The conflict should be over. And the conflict is not over, so what is possible to say is just some efforts, some policies which may lead to a comprehensive approach in the end, but finally the approach of Ukrainian state to justice in the context of the Donbas conflict will be a function of peace process. So what can be found today, what can be seen today, there are three types of wrongdoings, let's call it this way, in the context of the Donbas conflict that are being faced by Ukraine. First of all, it is we can call it political violence against the state, the very fact of separatism. The second is the direct violence that occurred during the warfare as such, and the third element is the social and economic rights of people affected by war. And well, as I already said, Ukraine does many steps in all these directions, but there is I do not see any comprehensive policy so far. This is actually one of the objects of my research that I'm doing right now, but this is also in the process, in the making, so maybe in a couple of months I will be possible to present it in more as a report, but so far I do not see such things. So to sum up, well, also I would like to show you maybe the dilemmas which inevitably appear whenever we talk about transitional justice. The ultimate goal of any transitional justice policy, I would say, is peace, is not non-recurrence of violence, as it is always sometimes called in the literature, in the documents. In order to achieve it, we need some efforts toward justice. The problem, however, appears that the very notion of justice is very unclear. At least two types of justice can be recalled. It's retributive justice and restorative justice. Either punishment or restoration of things as much as it is possible as they were before the violence appeared. And then, in order to achieve some justice,
there's also the question of the idea of a truth and reconciliation,
well, exactly,
that kind of justice.
Truth is important in order to achieve justice, whatever kind of justice we are talking about. We need to refer to truth. The problem, another problem appears with the truth, because, well, I would like to refer to words by L.B. Sachs, South African justice of the Constitutional Court, who Supreme Court, yeah, sorry. There's an interesting text of him where he describes 4 types of truth. These are microscopic truth, logical truth, experiential truth, and dialogical truth. And that's by no means this is any kind of saying that truth is relative. It's not about relativization. It's about, from different perspectives, truth can be, well, when we talk about microscopic truth, is that we just, as a scientist, watch some phenomenon, eliminate different variables, and try to say as much as possible about this phenomenon. Logical truth is something that that lawyers do in courts, basing on facts. We infer that something happened due to deduction. Sorry. Experiential truth is something that we experience, not necessarily having in mind any philosophical concepts as ordinary people experience. Dialogical truth is something, is a kind of truth which emerges when you bring together people who, for example, were fighting against each other, and they may have a dialogue and come up to some conclusions. So the problem with truth is that different types of truth can also can be controversial. What is established in court, for example, thanks to logical truth, is not necessarily the same as experiential truth of majority of people. So just to sum up, facing all these dilemmas is inevitably political. Therefore, it is very hard to say about any kind of rules that govern this field of knowledge, this field of practice. So maybe I will stop here. Maybe it will be easier to also to answer questions in the future.
Thank you, Igor, for first of all making the point very clear that unfortunately the debate on the post-conflict justice is not currently ongoing, and the more so describing the very sorry state of affairs as regards the transitional justice, to say the least, especially as this also comes against the background of the very limited international legal mechanisms that are available to people, to the victims of the conflict. And I speak here basically about the European Court of Human Rights, whereas even the state of Ukraine granted under the Donbas reintegration laws, right, the possibility for the Ukrainian citizens to sue Russia without any court fees. The problem is that the very nature of the hybrid conflict per se, with Russia pretending not to play a role in it and not to be a party to it, complicates the matter of the international legal enforcement of transitional justice measures. And as the discussion already steered into the matters of the establishing truth, which is also part of the transitional justice toolkit, I'd like to address the next question to Andriy Kohut and ask to what extent, in the context of transitional justice, but also the memory politics, the access to truth is guaranteed, and I mean not only the access to the archives that are under your supervision, but also to what extent the truth is shared among the different regions of Ukraine, and to which extent the truth commissions, part of the transitional justice process, are also tasked with a task to fight propaganda rather than establish truth, which is on its own a daunting measure. Thank you.
Дякую. Ну, власне, дуже хороше питання.
Thank you. When we talk about propaganda, understanding Soviet and Russian propaganda, I would like to add to what was previously presented concerning an example of one of my friends. He was taking a taxi, and taxi drivers are capable of describing everyday reality. So they were chatting about World War II and current events in Ukraine. And the taxi driver said the great patriotic war was like the Russian propaganda says, the great leader Stalin, and so on, the great victory. So when my friend asked him, well, if you believe this, that's your point of view, okay. But what happened in your family in the period? Well, so he gives an account of how people were drafted to the army, and then after the removal of German army, people were put on the front from the Red Army without any arms. They were fighting the Germans empty-handed. The lucky ones survived. So, asking what happened before World War II. So he tells me about the great hunger, the repressions, and it all concerned his family. It happened to his family. It's not stories from television. So what are we talking about? There is a gap, a huge gap between the narrative about history of the Soviet Union versus what actually happened to specific people, specific families. But they didn't have the capacity to associate the two. So his concepts about the state followed the slogans of the official narrative. So asking what do you know about history from your family events. So the point is the potential of these four laws on decommunization. The most important is access to archives from 2010, and it's very important as a basis. If we seek historical truth, it's not possible without access to archives. So talking about archives of the security forces, of the KGB and so on, non-researchers have the idea that these archives contains only true documents. But this again is susceptible to Russian and Soviet propaganda. We need to have a critical approach. So what we find in the archives, usually people who come to read documents in the archives are not the victims of repressions or their children, but it's the great children or even younger, for whom it's very important. During the current war in Ukraine, it's very important to be able to ask why Russia attacked Ukraine and why are we defending ourselves. Maybe not everything we heard about this fellow nation, our Russian brothers, we can verify how to critically evaluate this and answer the questions. People should be provided with answers. So looking at the long-term perspective about the changes in memory, it can't happen overnight. There are reasons why people think things over, and this is possible only with factual basis, with open access to archives. And that's that access to archives can be helpful in this way. As for current legislation in Ukraine and Poland and the divisions, well, our laws are very important because interpretation of history in terms of relations between Ukraine and Poland have previously been based on particular memories, but the archives show a different situation. And to the contrary, today we have a good time to work on documents, on archives in Ukraine, to try once again to answer the questions raised before. But the current situation shows that earlier answers to the questions were not satisfactory to any side. So often when we compare the Ukrainian law about the freedom fighters and the amendment of the IPN law in Poland, showing the limitations, that's one aspect. And the other, for me, working in the state security agency in Ukraine, enforcement of the law is not the issue number one. If we read these laws, we can find interesting things. In the Ukrainian law, it is stated that if you offend a person who fought for Ukraine's independence, I can quote it directly, then you are responsible according and accountable according to Ukrainian legislation. But the question is which laws you are accountable to. So that's in administrative law. So if a journalist or someone is lying in public, then he's subject to administrative justice with no penal sanctions. So this is a reference which is universal. So here you have civil justice for sanction. And in Polish legislation, there is criminal sanction foreseen. So in Ukraine, it's a specific declaration. So this law closed issues according to it, on which there were speculations by populists and nationalists. Parties like Svoboda, the ultra-right-wing movements, simply right-wing populists. They are very talkative, but I won't comment on that. Through this law, this issue was kind of taken off the agenda. So today the extreme right wing got only 2% of the vote in the last elections to parliament. So they didn't get any seat. So we are moving forward. There are more important issues. What is also interesting and also sad in the Polish law, that's the application of the term Eastern Little Poland. That's the same as same kind of measure as that applied by Russia, talking about Ukraine as Ruthenia. So we should focus on relations between states and not on their internal affairs. So to solve the problems, you need many, many years. At the beginning of 2018, there is a decline compared to 2017 of positive and negative attitudes towards Ukrainians. In 2017, positive attitudes to Ukrainians were more prevalent than negative, and now they have declined. Between 17 and 18, there is the Ukrainians, economic migrants to Poland, are a major issue for us too. And it's an open question which cannot be resolved overnight. Talking with my friends in Poland. In Poland, people are afraid. I don't know what should I say to this. Not talking about the Ukrainian society and state. Until now, there is no response. But the legislator wants to say that in Ukraine, we adopt laws on historical memory. There is an amendment of the law on rehabilitation. The current law was adopted in 1991 in April on the rehabilitation of victims of political repression in Ukraine. And depending on the terminology, you can determine when it was adopted. First of all, automatically rehabilitation applies to victims who were penalized without a court sentence. So such people are immediately rehabilitated. And to conclude, I'd like to say that this example is very important, because if we say that we are building a European democratic state, we are trying to implement those rules which function in the European Union, talking about values, about human rights. If we don't condemn and repair the atrocities of the past, how can our current attempts be perceived as fair and just? So I hope that our discussions with colleagues in Poland concerning historical memory will not be symmetrical. We ought to go forward talk to each other. And the two recent changes in Poland on historic memory in Poland and on rehabilitation in Ukraine, well, I would like the positive legislative changes in Ukraine to be also reflected in Polish legislation. I wonder when this will happen.
Debate, and this is basically the opportunity for Ukraine to get this historical narrative right, but also for bringing in this experiential dimension into the debate on justice and truth. Just to share with you the data from the research that was undertaken recently by the Ukrainian Mirror Weekly, Zerkalo Tyżnia, who interviewed nearly 2,000 members of the family of the people, both civilians and military personnel who fell victims of the war in the Donbass. 71% of those did respond that they would not support granting pardon and amnesty to all as demanded in the Minsk agreement. Moreover, over 90% of those did say that they would not support the state policy that would allow to grant amnesty and pardon to those who committed serious crimes on the territory of the temporarily occupied territories. And this is where I would also want to bring in Professor Meleshevych to the debate, not only to discuss the issue of the invisible voters that was also raised yesterday. What is the Ukrainian policy regarding, in the context also of its electoral law reforms, regarding the safeguard of the social and political rights of the people that find themselves in the occupied territories, and also part of the transitional justice mandate, so to say. What is the current state of affairs with criminal justice, including not only the lustration or vetting processes, but also the fight against corruption as part of the transitional justice process?
Thank you so much. I would like to remind the theme of our panel, actually, it's memory and justice at a time of transformation. And several days ago, Andriy, you sent us a list of questions that we should consider, that you're going to raise at this panel. And I was surprised, actually, on one hand, I was surprised that there was no mention of corruption, because corruption is such an important topic. If you look at the roots of both revolutions, actually corruption was one of the main reasons why these revolutions happened. Probably it was the main reasons behind the Orange Revolution, behind the Revolution of Dignity. But on the other hand, I was not surprised because it raises a question actually that I am going to address, at least in part in my brief presentation. Is corruption a legitimate topic for an academic research? And it's not an easy question. It's a very difficult question because in the interest for the topic of corruption among political scientists, social sciences in general, has not been even in the past 50 years. In the 60s, there was an interest, elevated interest for the topic of corruption as part of political development literature. The major focus of this research was not about good governance versus corrupted governance, but the major focus of research was whether corruption promotes economic development. So corruption was an independent variable and political economic development dependent variable, and economic and political development, of course, was generally perceived as a good thing, and if corruption advances political economic development, so it's a good thing as well. And then for about 3 decades, the interest for corruption studies was at the very bottom. I don't know, can we see the first graph that I gave you? This is what I did. This is the frequency of the use of the word corruption in the title of papers, including in the programs of Midwest Political Science Association, beginning in 1991 until this year. Midwest, so for those of you who are not familiar with conferences in political science, Midwest Political Science Conference, probably this is the most important, the most prominent conference in, well, this is your opinion. I think that it beats American political science by far. In any case, but this is the conference that has searchable database that you can search, except of those 3 years, 2010 to 2013. So it represents a graph. So you can see that beginning 1991 until the time of colored revolution, the interest for corruption was extremely low. There was 1-2 papers out of thousands of papers presented at this conference that were devoted to corruption. But then something happened during the time of colored revolutions, including the Orange Revolution. So it was 2004, 2005, 2006, when the interest for corruption studies jumped. So significantly jumped, 3, 4, 5 times jumped. And it stays, currently we can state that corruption studies actually represent mainstream of political science research. So the interest for corruption topics actually pretty high, and a significant number or proportion of papers, of panels devoted to this topic. Can we go to the second slide? The second slide represents International Political Science Association, and it goes back to 2006, again, the first searchable database in Fukuoka in Japan, and you can see the same, basically the same pattern, just a little bit moved chronologically. The interest elevated, you know, in Madrid, in Montreal, in 2012, 2014, and the most important interest actually was in Poznan last 2 years ago when the last conference of International Political Science Association took place. So the interest for corruption significantly elevated. So what happened? How can we explain that in the past 10 years, scholars and universities across the world started paying close attention to corruption, anti-corruption studies. Corruption topics entered the mainstream of political science research. In other words, big bang interest in corruption studies took place in many countries across the world. How can be explained? To give an answer to this question, one has to look at the transitional paradigm of the third wave of democratization. Again, the third wave started in Portugal in 1974, and there was a huge number of countries across the world that started movement toward democratic transition. Some of them were pretty successful, and they ended up firmly in the democratic camp. Some of them were it was complete failure, and they moved back toward the authoritarian regime. But the point that a large group of countries ended up in the so-called gray zone. So they did not move forward, they did not backtrack toward, fell back to the authoritarian regime. And this interest actually, it caused the elevated interest for corruption studies. Two scholars are instrumental here. I would like to refer to Tomasz, who actually talks about the end of democratic transition paradigm. He talks about democratic transition fatigue. He talks about unfulfilled expectations in transitional countries, countries that stuck in transition and stay forever in the so-called gray zone. And then another author that gave also some helpful hints, answers in his works, Larry Diamond, who actually attributed such prolonged state of unfinished democratic transitions to the lack of transparency, accountability, and political will, or inability to fight corruption and establish the rule of law in these countries. He writes, and this is a direct quote, that no problem has more seriously eroded public confidence in democratic institutions and the stability of electoral democracies than corruption in government and party politics. In other words, the current interest of scholars to the study of corruption is justifiable, understandable, and timely. In fact, it provides the second breath to the studies of democratic transitions. Ukraine is not an exception. Both major political events that took place in the country during this millennium, the Orange Revolution and the Revolution of Dignity, were in fact anti-corruption movements and efforts among the most politically active Ukrainian citizens. There are many roots of corruption, and different countries have similar roots of corruption, but the communist camp, post-communist countries have a very specific, special, I would say, reason for corruption, ideological corruption. In addition to issues of power, greediness, we have this ideological reason of corruption, and I will explain you why. What I mean. I graduated from law school at Kyiv University, and the very first day we entered the classroom, our dean came and said, "Hello, ideological workers." And he gave this quote from Lenin. Basically, he said that право это возведенное, it was in Russian, право это возведенная в закон воля господствующего класса. He referred also to Marx and Engels from Communist Manifesto, who said, "Your law is the will of your class given the authority of a statute." Of course, they referred to the bourgeoisie. Then Lenin said also, "Law is the expression of the will of the classes which had won the victory and kept the government power in their hands." Another quote from a scholar in the 40s, American scholar with the Russian name, who studied Soviet law. He said that the Soviet law corresponds to the interest of the proletariat, organized into ruling class. The Communist Party is supposed to be the sole representative of this interest. The Soviet law must be presented in the party light and get party decision. The courts and law enforcement bodies have to carry out the policy of the Communist Party as well as the Marxist-Leninist doctrine. So what we see two important things. First of all, law is a political instrument. It's not a social regulator. Well, of course, law can be and political interest and social regulator, but in the former Soviet Union, it was first above all political instrument, less of social regulator. But what is also important, that there was a controlling agency, that to use this political instrument was allowed to advance purposes and objectives of the Communist Party. So the Communist Party actually played in this particular regard a positive role. They were a check, a control on law enforcement bodies, how they used the law. But what happened in 1991? The Soviet Union is gone, the Communist Party is over. And the same people who were sitting, taking seats, in the law enforcement bodies, in the courts, they are the same. And they know that law is a political instrument, but there are no controls over their activities. And this is probably the most important root, the most important reason of corruption in the former Soviet countries. I want to give you anecdotal evidence. Try to get to search engine, any search engine, and type in Ukrainian дорожно-транспортна пригода, прокурор, суддя, in other words, road accident, judge, prosecutors. And you will be amazed, or maybe you will not be amazed, but you will see that almost any time when we hit road accident judge and procurator, we will see that somebody is always drunk, somebody always violates traffic rules, and this somebody always drives a very expensive car. Mercedes, Audi, this is I took just last year. SUV, Ford Mustang, just recently, judge from Zhytomyr Oblast who was drunk and hit somebody. So we can also look at tax declaration of these people and see what real estate property they had. So of course this is anecdotal evidence, but this evidence helps someone to come to understanding why courts and law enforcement today are among the least trusted institutions in the Ukrainian society. In the eyes of the public, they are at the heart, the essence, the fabric of corruption. Until these people would use law as political instrument for his, in particular this case, for their own benefit, we will not be able to overcome corruption in our country. Throughout post-independent Ukraine, the top political elite tried to tightly control courts and law enforcement via loyal political appointments. Kuchma was quite successful. Under Yushchenko, it was a little bit different. He attempted to control security service. Tymoshenko and her party, courts, the party of regions to some extent were successful in controlling public prosecutor office. So it was kind of balance of powers. At least there was not centralization of control over courts and law enforcement appointments. This is exactly what happened under the Yanukovych regime, who was able to establish very tight control over all major courts and law enforcement appointments. What the situation currently? What is the situation, attitudes, and how the current president acts toward the courts and law enforcement bodies? I view the current president, Ukrainian president, as a transitional president who is a product of the Soviet past, who wants Ukraine to move away from this Soviet past, to move away from the Russian Empire and to join the European community. But this is another topic. I'm not going to discuss further the president of Ukraine. But
I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to be very brief.
Okay, no, just 1 minute, I will finish. I hope it's not censorship, since
Far from it, but no one can control the clock.
Okay. The point that for the sake of this discussion, I argue that current Ukrainian president views law enforcement bodies and courts in old traditional way, Soviet way, as political instruments, and he and the most of his political surroundings want to control this powerful political instrument. And an example of the appointment of Yuri Lutsenko to the crucially important post of Prosecutor General of Ukraine in May 2016 is a telling example. I just want to remind that the former Prosecutor General was dismissed, and the president wanted to appoint Yuri Lutsenko, who is politically loyal to him. However, Lutsenko did not have law degree and formal law education, and the law on public prosecutor office in Ukraine demands the prosecutor general to have such education. As a result, in one single day, the amendments to this law were introduced, scraping these requirements. The national parliament voted for them. The new text was published, and the president signed the bill. Let me emphasize, everything has been done in one day. Compare with anti-corruption court story, which lasts for many years already. Everything is legal, of course. The point that I'm trying to make that current political elite is in no hurry to lose control over law enforcement bodies and the courts. In this regard, they are not that different from those who were in power in Ukraine before the Revolution of Dignity. However, the political situation in Ukraine and the country itself is vastly different from what it used to be. And there are three things which I just list. First of all, international push for anti-corruption reforms, which is crucially important, and the current Ukrainian elite listens to international pressure to conduct anti-corruption reforms. The second thing, vibrant and healthy civil society in Ukraine, which plays a crucially instrumental role to advance these reforms. And also, to some extent, there were a mechanism developed in the past several years that provides independent and independent mechanism in law enforcement. And I can name you that just recent election of the head of the Constitutional Court, which is a scholar, actual professor from my university, Kyiv Academy, who is independent person. The new composition of the Supreme Court that went through a pretty tight and pretty transparent selection process. NABU, National Anti-Corruption Bureau, which proved to be independent player in the anti-corruption area sphere. Special Prosecutor Office, and hopefully Anti-Corruption Court will be also formed pretty recently. The very final point. Yesterday, I asked a question about the relative deprivation hypothesis. I said that Latin American scholars came up with this term. What is a relative deprivation hypothesis? That we have very high level of expectations. And we actually, in Latin America, what happened after this relatively successful democratic transition, when democratic forces came to power, were elected to office, they were not able to deliver what they promised. And then there was a switch came back of authoritarian forces who were elected into office through democratic means. This is what relative deprivation hypothesis. In Ukraine, it's a complicated situation, complicated country, but there are plenty of positive signs that Ukraine moves to the right direction. Of course, we want these changes to happen fast, overnight. Unfortunately, it's not going to happen. But again, the overall dynamic, I am pretty satisfied. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Meleshevych. So those extremely important remarks which show that the application of law as a political instrument to corruption is very worth comparing with the application of law as a political instrument to memory. I'm very sorry, ladies and gentlemen. I would love to give everyone a right to reply. I would love to open this up to the floor, but I'm on very strict instructions, which I have already disobeyed by several minutes, to bring this panel to an end and invite everyone for a briefer cup of coffee or tea than was the case yesterday before we start the next panel. So please thank all of our excellent panelists for these very stimulating discussions.